Mohamed Erian, the former PIMCO CEO, now, of course, the chief economist at Allianz, and also our Bloomberg View columnist. So, Mohamed, okay, you know, data dependent, as Matt says, is good that the Fed is doing this. But the fact of the matter is, some say that, you know, including Michael Showell yesterday, actually, who was on, he was like, he thinks it's a mistake that the Fed is data dependent. And in fact, they have to bring in more factors when it comes to monetary policy. Otherwise, they may find themselves having made a big mistake by raising rates too early.
So I think that there's so many issues here, Betty. One is which data. Secondly,
exactly.
how clear is that data? But there's a third issue that we have to focus on. You're absolutely right, the three of you, in saying that the Fed doesn't want us to look at the date or obsessed with the date of the liftoff, but wants us to look at a shallow path. At some point, it's going to take us beyond that. It says not only is the path going to be very shallow, but the terminal level is going to be much lower than what has been in history. So the Fed is trying, like you said, and this sounds almost contradictory, to remain unusually easy while it tightens. And that's a new experiment, and it's one that's going to be very interesting for markets to navigate through.
Do you think that they will be able to successfully execute the experiment? What are the risks that could go wrong?
I think the biggest risk is that they are too successful. What do I mean by that? I mean by that they are very successful in boosting up asset prices, and they continue to decouple asset prices from the fundamentals, and they don't get the support from fiscal policy, from structural reforms that's needed to validate the asset prices. So the biggest risk is they may end up being too successful in a narrow sense and unsuccessful in a bigger sense.
Hasn't that, I mean, that's already happened, hasn't it? They have decoupled asset prices from the real economy, and they have been very successful in getting Congress to rely 100% on the Fed for running the economy and not really paying attention to the balance sheet at all.
Yeah, and that's the big problem, right? In that their success helps others become more complacent. It's the typical moral hazard. You see it here. You see it happening in Europe now with the ECB having gone all in on its QE. So, yeah, there's a moral hazard issue, and they're worried about that. They can't vocalize it too much, but they are worried about that.
You know, Mohamed, so I know you're very active on Twitter, and we've been following. You know, we've been following some of the tweets. You often tweet right after a very big market event. So I thought this was interesting. I want to pull up. I don't know if you can see it, but our viewers can see it. Guys, can we pull up that tweet where Mohamed? Okay, well, it's not the tweet. It's actually the chart that you tweeted out, Mohamed, about financial bubbles around the world, courtesy of The Economist. I have to say, number per decade at the highest level since the 1860s. What does that tell you, Mohamed?
It tells us that there's only one policy instrument that's in play right now, and that policy instrument can only operate through the financial markets, what they call the financial asset channel, and therefore it has to cause a bubble in order to have any hope of triggering an economic response. So that's the reality we're in. Now, interestingly, we were in the same reality in 06, 07, but it was the private markets that were doing it. Now it's the central banks that are doing it. So it's slightly different, but I think the biggest concern, especially for those of us who are parents,
well, that's even worse, though, Mohamed. That's even worse if the central banks are behind it.
Well, worse and not worse. I mean, the big advantage of central banks behind it is you cannot force a liquidation of a central bank. You cannot force a central bank to delever, right? And therefore, it's not as dangerous as where we were in 06, 07, but it's far away from the first best.
But does this, I mean, does the Fed have a conundrum here in the possible bubble of the U.S. dollar? I mean, if it raises rates, the dollar gets stronger, and that further decouples the real economy from asset prices because obviously, the men and women working on things that they want to sell overseas aren't going to be able to make their wages.
So you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the issues today is that we also have divergent monetary policy. We have the Fed that's slowly taking its foot off the accelerator, and we have the ECB that has its foot all the way down and shows no sign of wanting to take it off. In fact, if anything, they're going to try to turbocharge that accelerator in order to minimize the contagion from Greece. Only one market is going to react to trying to reconcile that. That is the foreign exchange market. Other policy instruments that should be used are not being used. So yes, the prospects are for the dollar getting stronger, and companies are going to adjust. What I don't understand, and the three of you have a better view, is they can hedge, right? This is not as if they are powerless. Companies can do more foreign exchange hedging. In the short term, that's going to push the dollar stronger,
right,
but at least it's going to protect them in the long term.
Mohammed, did I read an article recently, though, that you have most of your money in cash? Is that right?
So what I've done is I've barbelled my exposure. If you ask the question, what's the most expensive part of the markets, it's where everybody has been pushed into by central banks. That's the most heavily trafficked part of the market. It is the public market. It is public equities and public bonds. So in reaction to that, people, including me, have been barbelling, taking some of that exposure back into cash and then taking some of that exposure into higher risk, less liquid, less public exposures where it's harder for the central bank to push people in. So think of it as barbelling in order to minimize exposures to the part of the market that is most heavily trafficked because of central banks.
While the S&P is up 2% so far in 2015, Japan's Nikkei and the Hang Seng Index in Hong Kong surged more than 12% this year when measured in U.S. dollars. Yet some investors remain skeptical about the ability of these markets to live up to their valuation. So Mohammed, would you agree that maybe now is the time of reckoning for U.S. and foreign investors to look at Asian stocks, or is it too late?
So we have to understand what is going on. The major theme in the equity market for years has been the central bank trade. Whenever you've seen one central bank be more stimulative than another, then you are to expect higher equity prices and a weaker currency. It started with the U.S. in 2010.
Yep.
It then went on to Japan. It then went on to the ECB, and China is the latest, has been the latest to join into more stimulative. This 100 basis points cut in the reserve requirement is the largest since 2008, just to put it in context. So if you believe in central bank continuing to be committed, yes, and effective, more uncertain, then this trade makes sense. But it is the classic central bank trade that has rewarded equity investors and currency investors well.
Has this move, though, in Asia, and particularly we're talking about Chinese shares, has it surprised even you, the pace of it?
The rebound in China has, and what's interesting is to see how the authorities are torn. On the one hand, they want to stimulate the economy. On the other hand, they really are worried about a bubble there because of how the equity market has been responding. And they've been trying to strike that balance, and it's a very hard balance to strike. Now, the advantage that China has is they're less open. So they have more flexibility to pursue contradictory objectives, as absurd as that sounds. But when you're in a closed economy, you have a lot more degrees of freedom than when you're in an open economy.
You do, right? Because you can kind of do what you want and be able to control the outcome. Mohammed, just finally on China, though, I mean, you know, we were talking about this Kaiser default, this Chinese property developer, but also, you know, the bond and the default, you know, the dollar-denominated bond, and the default by the Chinese power company. I mean, are these worrying signs, or paradoxically, is it actually a good thing that the Chinese are letting these companies default?
So I, like Joe and others, will take the latter. It's a good thing because they're showing that they're willing to let the market impose discipline. Again, it's the objective of trying to control excessive risk-taking. Why is it not as risky as somewhere else? Because they can contain the contagion. So I see this as yet another step that China is taking towards more market discipline, and they have the balance sheet to be able to contain the contagion.
Now, I read your column yesterday. I loved it, Mohammed, on Greece, right? So you talked about, oh, are we now heading into a Grexit for a Grexit? And you were gaming this out. You were saying, look, there's a 45% chance we might see some sort of messy compromise. There's a 10% chance we'll actually see a meaningful breakthrough. And now a 45% chance that Greece might actually exit the euro. So how did you come to that latter conclusion?
Yeah, and that's a big change. In the past, it was a question of Grexit versus muddle through and hopefully make it. Now, there's a real chance of an accident. And what I mean by an accident is that Greece ends up exiting not because someone makes a formal decision, not because Greece makes a formal decision or Germany makes a formal decision, but rather because it's pushed out, as happened in Argentina in December 2001 when it was pushed out of its dollar peg. Now, why is that happening? First, they are losing the structural holders of their paper. Examples, and Bloomberg has ran really good stories on this. Subsidiaries of Greek bank abroad have got the tap on the shoulder saying, sell your Greek bonds. Bank depositors are increasing their withdrawal of money. The ECB is getting more nervous about the emergency liquidity assistance that is providing Greece. So there's less liquidity. It's getting sucked out of the system. I think you already saw they've put their hands by decree on the money of local governments. The next issue is going to be domestic IOUs. And at some point, defaults are going to occur. So unless Greece and its creditors change course fundamentally, we are heading towards an accident, which increasing the probability of exit. I do not believe, and this is important, I do not believe that Greece can exit and stay in the Eurozone. Some do, I don't.
Interesting. All right, Mohammed, we're going to have to leave it there. Great to see you, Mohammed. As always, Mohammed Al-Erian, our Bloomberg View columnist and chief economic advisor to Allianz.